Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's edition of SIG Node. It is Tuesday, February 15th, 2022. That's a lot of twos. Today, we have a relatively short agenda in SIG Node, but I'd like to start by handing the floor to Sergey so he can talk about PRs.
Yeah, we have a great progress on PRs, and I think most of it kudos to James for cleaning up things. I saw James going like, don't wait for PRs to roll, especially for PRs that needs rebase and never been looked at for a while. And we merging a lot. So you can look at statistics. Statistics are quite good. We have 17 merged and 21 closed, which is like very unusual. So thank you everybody for doing reviews, and special thanks to Dims.
Yeah, Dims is rocking it. Thank you, Dims. Sergey, just to put some of these numbers in context for us, like where is that 154 open PRs live sort of historically for our open PRs? Is that better? Is that worse? I think it's better.
So almost a minimal number historically. So I don't remember being much smaller than that.
Amazing.
It's almost historical minimal.
Awesome. Cool. Well, it's good to hear that. Let's see. Next on the agenda, before we jump into things, I should probably remind folks about dates. We have a soft freeze coming up for SIG Node. So if you've checked the email mailing list, you might see an email about this talking about what our soft freeze is. To ensure that we actually can complete beta features on time and that we have enough time to review alpha features and GAs. We ask that if you have a beta feature or a deprecation, it should be merged by this date. And if you have an alpha feature or a GA, you should have a work in progress PR open, preferably a reviewable PR if possible, so we'll have enough time to look at it. So that date is coming up faster than you would expect. I believe our soft freeze is March 4th, which is in about 2 weeks, 2.5 weeks. So keep that in mind as you're working on your KEPs. Next up on the agenda, we have Rodrigo with a friendly ping for the user namespace KEP. Sounds very friendly. Thank you. Anything you want to cover?
Yes, I think that is basically it. I wanted to ping the reviewers because none have reviewed yet, and ideally we're aiming for 125. We did get a review from Tim Hawking, and we have a look good to me, but none from SIG Node reviewers. So.
Rodrigo, like Giuseppe pinged me earlier today. I promised a review by the end of the week. I'll do it earlier.
Cool.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that is all for me. Thanks.
Awesome. Next up, we have Vinay's regular in-place pod vertical scaling update, but it looks like he won't be able to make the meeting. And looks like Derek left a comment saying that he has reviewed the first commit, left a number of comments, and is hoping to get through the rest today and tomorrow. Derek, do you have anything else to add for the recording?
Yeah, so I got through the first commit, which is where all the API types are for folks who've been looking at it. And maybe for others who would see in the recording, I didn't, the PR adds changes to the spec fields of a pod as well as the status field. And to date, we haven't done this in the past since this new machinery is added, but the machinery was in place to drop fields in the spec when the feature gate is disabled, but nothing was being done to drop it in status. So just to call out in the future, if you have pod API changes, to make sure that we're dropping both in spec and status when the feature is disabled. So Vinay, you'll see those comments. And then maybe just for those in the call, just we took a poll, the KEP was very open-ended on if resize policy for a given resource should be mutable post-creation of the pod. And I didn't actually have a strong feeling on why that can't be changed or not. And so if folks would see a use case where you want to say, after the creation of a pod, no, it actually changed my mind, you can change the CPU field dynamically or not. Maybe we could make resize policy mutable. And then the last comment was, in the existing PR, I believe quota can be gamified because it's not taking the max of resources allocated versus resources. And so if the kubelet can never relinquish those resources, you'll be able to gamify quota. So we'll have to settle that, but I hope to get to the kubelet changes in this afternoon or tomorrow, but I appreciate Vinay's patience. So anyway, that's all I had. And if folks want to jump in on those topics, feel free.
Awesome. Nothing for me. Anything for anyone else? Sounds like no.
No, there is one more topic just added by Marlo.
Oh, there's two more. So before we go to Marlowe's, let's go to, I think Deep has something on pod sandbox condition kept next steps.
Yeah, so so far I addressed the initial set of comments from you, Ilana and Derek. So thanks for the first round of reviews. I clarified some of the use cases a little more around the things that this can surface. Also chatted a bit with Sally O'Malley, who is I think doing a lot of stuff around the kubelet-based tracing and based on the conversation, just kind of refine the use case a little more to highlight like how the pod sandbox conditions will surface a few more different things than the immediate focus of the tracing kept. So if you can take another look, that'd be great.
Yeah, thanks, Steve. So yeah, I think when I first reviewed this, and I think Ilana, maybe you can share the same feeling, I wasn't 100% convinced that we should expose these conditions yet. And that's why I think I was trying to probe if the tracing stuff would let you satisfy the use case. Is the TLDR though that you don't feel the tracing stuff lets you satisfy your use case and you think the conditions must be propagated? And then did you think adjacent projects like KubeState metrics needed to be updated in order to read this condition? How did you see this getting plumbed end to end?
Yeah, so the overall use case is definitely something like KubeState metrics that reports things at a very high cardinality, which is like at the pod level cardinality, and basically just grabbing it from the pod conditions itself, the state that the pod is in, and surfacing it up through KubeState metrics, basically. As like this is the duration it took to create the sandbox, and this is the amount of duration it took to complete the sandbox creation process, basically. The overall scenario is pretty much is that right now the pod initialize condition, it has different meanings depending on whether there are init containers present in the pod or not. And so when init containers are present, it actually waits for all the way till the init containers complete before it says that the initialized condition is satisfied. If there are no init containers present, then as soon as the pod is scheduled, pretty much as soon as it gets started, the initialized condition is set. So there were reasons to do it that way, but essentially the sandbox conditions kind of clarifies that condition to really say that the condition of the pod at the point where the sandbox is initialized is satisfied, and when the sandbox is actually done setting up, surface basically both aspects of it.
Yeah, I guess I'll add to what Derek said. When I reviewed this sort of from a node perspective, to me, at least as this was currently envisioned, the adding like, okay, we've started sandbox creation and then sandbox creation is completed. It just seems a little incomplete, right? Like there's this entire pod life cycle and we're focusing on adding conditions for just this one step of it. And there's like nothing in there for sandbox teardown, which is maybe relevant. And in theory, like something like tracing will like cover this entire life cycle. Now, granted, tracing might not give us a deep dive on every single pod because of like necessary sampling, right? It can be very high cardinality data, so we're not going to necessarily have something for everything. But if it sort of depends on what the debugging data is going to be used for. But just the way that you're describing some of these use cases, it feels like, there might be some great scenarios where we're going to use this data, but they feel a little bit like workaroundy to me. And so like, I would say, maybe think bigger, like what is, the actual problem we're trying to solve here. Is just adding these two conditions. Like, is this going to be a, give a mouse a cookie situation where we add these two conditions, but then we want to add this one and this one and this one, and like, what's our overall picture look like? Because we're definitely not capturing that full life cycle with this cap, I think. And the other question is, if that's not enough, how do we get something that is enough, and how do we use that? So I would just encourage us to like make sure that we're thinking through all of those alternatives, and that we're like convinced that yes, this definitely is the best option. Like here is the like 80-20 use case or something like that, before we go and add something like this.
Cool, sounds good. What would be the next steps here? Like, would you like me to clarify or like refine the user stories a little more?
So if I recall, Deep, so I don't think we'll get this cap implemented this release cycle, right? Unfortunately, we didn't get consensus at the time. So we can keep iterating on the cap. I agree with everything Ilana said. And so my recollection on your use case was you as a cluster operator are only responsible for the playground in which a container can launch, and not necessarily responsible for the success of that container. And this condition was going to let you distinguish that use case. I guess like Ilana, I have to think through if that alone does it, but I'm not sure how many others have that situation. I can appreciate the init container distinction, as you said. But yeah, trying to think through like if there are other things in your situation that we might need. The part that gives me some pause is just personally, I don't really love that we even would expose the concept of a sandbox to the end user API. It doesn't really mean anything to me as an end user. Yeah, even this discussion is helpful, I guess, to know that the tracing wasn't sufficient.
Right, like essentially, like the overall use case we're getting at is like we are in a situation where we are operating like a multi-tenant cluster, and essentially like there's the ops team that is kind of responsible for, say, the CSI plugins, the CNI plugins that are going into the platform level, and then there are specific customers who are launching their workloads, right? So essentially, the customers want the ops team to be making the right decisions, and in terms of saying that, hey, we want like a max of say 30-second SLO on like when my pod gets to launch after it's scheduled. And so this would be mainly geared towards generating SLIs and SLOs around how long the sandbox creation is taking, which in turn is dependent on the CSI.
Yeah. So then maybe we could talk through like the dependent steps in the pod lifecycle to get the scenario end to end, right? So like, I don't know if we can properly capture, did the image get pulled yet within that SLO time? I'm trying to think of other requisite steps that might occur in kubelet recognition to pod execution, but there might be some additional conditions we don't have that for you to meet your scenario you'd want to identify. And maybe even we might call out like if the resultant pool, the registry you're pulling from isn't present, what happens in that scenario for you as well for meeting your SLO. So yeah, either way, we can update the cap a little bit, but if the overarching theme is I want to provide an SLO on time to pod getting bound to a kubelet to time to pod being run, and then I want to report on that, We then probably want to talk through like if there's gaps when you have short-lived workloads in the corresponding scrape interval through like cube state metrics, that like, is that even sufficient for you to then demonstrate you met your SLO?
Is the sandbox a good proxy for this? Like that would be my other question is I think like we're trying to use it as a proxy signal as an SLI, but I'm not actually sure if that's enough. Like, does a sandbox fail to fully set up if, for example, like a pod hangs on like a mount or something like that? Because like that's sort of a classical example of you know, a thing that like delays pod start latency.
Yeah, exactly. So those are the specific use cases that are enumerated in the KEP, as in like, you know, let's say we introduce a CSI plugin and that causes the mounts to start failing. Like how would these conditions look like in those specific scenarios? You know, what if the mounts are delayed versus what if they fail completely? And same with, let's say, introduction of like a CNI plugin where say IPAM is taking a while, as well as a specialized CRI runtime handler, like say, if the operator wants to introduce micro VMs in their cluster, like how would this work out basically? So yeah, right now, the user stories are calling out all these scenarios, but you know, happy to add say termination if that is desired to be explored, and anything else.
I don't think any customers are complaining about termination. Usually, it's usually, well, when is my pod starting? That's the most important.
Cool. Do we have any other discussion on this topic? Oh, I wanted to call out because there was a question in the chat. When is kubelet tracing expected to be implemented? That's currently targeted for alpha in this release 124. Okay, sounds
Great.
like there's, oh, is there anything else?
Oh no, I was saying great. We'll keep iterating on the KEP.
Cool. Thanks so much.
Cool. Actually, Deep, one other question then. There was a KEP that Mike Brown, I believe, put through on related to image pool authentication issues. And I guess in general, to your overarching user story, if the user supplied the creds to pool the image, and those creds were invalid, the sandbox would never get created. And that would be a scenario where you might be out of SLA. So maybe if you want to catch up on some of the image pool cred stuff and see if that would tie in to what is it you were responsible for versus what your users are, that would be a good, very core enhancement.
Okay, I'll definitely take a look and update the user stories based on that.
Cool, thanks. All the best.
Awesome. Okay, let's move on to our final agenda item from Marlo, request for continued discussion regarding CPU management here.
Yeah, so we still have the old doc, which I guess I should link back in, where I've asked for feedback. Basically, I'm trying to figure out where we can be useful in general in the community regarding updating documentation to handle particular use cases that may already be available that just aren't well documented. And then additionally, to figure out what next steps are. One thing that has broken out is a desire for a plugin model, whether that's at the CPU layer or at the topology layer. There's some some discussion going on as far as resource management, so that people can handle their particular use cases instead of continuing to complicate the kubelet. But that's a full discussion. I'm not saying we go any particular direction or even that we do it, but that discussion I think is useful. And then from that, maybe we can pull out something that is useful, whether it's long-term or short-term, that won't break the current functionality in kubelet or complicate it any further. That's my request.
Awesome. Do we want to get any feedback now, or have you sent this ping to the mailing list as well? That might be handy.
I can send it. Yeah, I should send it to the mailing list. You're right. We do have some feedback also from people in Singapore on the other time zones that don't like this meeting because it's 2 o'clock in the morning for them. So mailing list is probably a good call. Thank you for that.
Yeah, no problem. Okay, we are out of agenda items. Is there any last minute business, or shall we adjourn for the day? We can get half an hour back. Going once, going twice. Okay, let's wrap it up. It was lovely to see everyone, and I'll see you next week at SIG Node or tomorrow in the CI subproject. Cheers, everyone.
Everyone.
Bye.
Bye.